So I get to track all of the different fun weather events that are developing in every country, the different amplifications they're taking. What does it mean for the US? Is it hitting an iron ore mine that's critical in Australia that impacts the steel production in China that impacts the imports here in the US, or the Taiwan drought impacting the microchip processing plant?
Today on the Daily Scoop podcast from the Scoop News Group, meet Sonny Wescott, CISA's Chief Meteorologist. We chatted about the weather, obviously, but also AI, climate change, data centers, and much more. Welcome to the Daily Scoop podcast, where you'll hear the latest news and trends facing government leaders. I'm the host of the Daily Scoop podcast, Billy Mitchell. Thanks so much for joining me. You're surely used to your local TV or radio stations having chief meteorologists. But did you know that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency also has one? Yep, that's right. Sonny Wescott is a federal emergency response official and the chief meteorologist with the Department of Homeland Security's CISA, specializing in national extreme weather hazards and climatological studies for impacts to public and private sector key resources. While much of what Wescott does is related to CISA's larger infrastructure portfolio and managing climate and weather-related events on that, she's quite fluent in the tech space and does deal quite a bit with those topics' relation to subjects like cybersecurity, computing, and artificial intelligence. I recently caught up with Wescott at ACT-IAC's Imagination ELC event in Hershey, Pennsylvania. During our conversation, we touched on her unique role, the dual relation between AI and the environment, and what's ahead as technology becomes so much more resource intensive. Let's go now to that interview with Sonny Wescott. Well, Sonny, nice to meet you here at ACT-IAC ELC. I was thrilled to see, I didn't even know that CISA had a chief meteorologist, and thrilled to see that you were here speaking and got the chance to meet you, and now we get to chat.
Yeah, I've been with CISA since before CISA was CISA. So back in our earlier on days, I've been around. I believe I'm on 7.5 years now, doing different parts of the mission on the critical infrastructure side of the house. Everything from team lead on our ops floor to executive briefer, telecoms, geospatial work, and now doing the sole extreme weather outreach effort within the entirety of our agency. So I get to be the chief meteorologist of all things climate and weather engagement.
Well, that's very cool, and I think if our listeners are anything like me, they might not know that, the agency had that role. So I'd love to start there because it's super interesting to me, especially as it intersects with cybersecurity, IT, the digital space, and the implications from the climate and the weather space and things like that. So talk to me about the work you do as chief meteorologist for CISA.
Yeah. We have 16 critical infrastructure sectors. What I've done is I've taken the entirety of the extreme weather mission, which is the uneven distribution of heating and the amplification to weather hazards that it brings. So we have 8 main weather hazards that are amplified by that. And so that includes everything from severe weather to extreme heat, extreme cold, tropical cyclones, sea level rise, our wildfires, our drought, all of those get tied in, making them consumable for our sector engagement. So everyone who owns any piece of infrastructure, bridges, roadways, runways, so the supply chain, the actual sites within themselves, so our DoD sites, our healthcare facilities, our healthcare staff. On the IT side of the house, the data centers where their physical locations are, the telecommunications, interdependencies with the electric sector, so where are our substations, where are our power plants, what threats do they face weather-wise. So there's good tie-in because the vast majority of the disruption to the energy grid actually comes from weather events. So it's not just any weather event. A lot of people think it's tropical cyclones. They're like, oh, hurricanes are our biggest problem here in the U.S., and that's not true. It's actually severe weather. So severe weather is all year round, which is amazing for me as we go forward into a warming world. It actually amplifies lightning, straight-line wind damage, hail events. We've recently seen bowling ball-sized hail in the U.S. coming down at 150 miles per hour, taking out our renewables, taking out our pipelines, taking out all of our different critical infrastructure sectors as these things come down. The tornadoes, seeing more tornadoes per tornado day. What does that do to our infrastructure? But also the disruption of the communities. So whether it hits the site or it hits the staff, there's a big implication of loss there. The supply chain doesn't just stop in the U.S. These events are changing worldwide. So I get to track all of the different fun weather events that are developing in every country, the different amplifications they're taking. What does it mean for the U.S.? Is it hitting an iron ore mine that's critical in Australia that impacts the steel production in China that impacts the imports here in the U.S., or the Taiwan drought impacting the microchip processing plant, and all of the energy sector and all of the different critical manufacturing plants coming back on the tail end of that disaster and looking at what does it mean to operate when you have single points of failure like that. Another good one, the healthcare facility looking at IV bags with the most recent storm Helene that rolled through in North Carolina. And then the next storm, Milton, aiming at the next IV major production facility. So we're seeing a lot of these back-to-back threats at an increasing rate, taking on additional hazards. This week's a great example. We have a major winter storm, wildfire threats, tropical cyclone developing, severe weather outbreak. We get a little bit of flavor of everything as we move into what is supposed to be a very intensive winter going in. So there's definitely no shortage of work or engagement.
Nothing scary about that. It sounds like you need more of you to do that job as these things get just more intense.
That is absolutely the case. I definitely advocate that all meteorological support has a place in the future. I'm a prior Air Force lead meteorologist, so my background's in operations. Getting to do support when it comes to troop movements, the drop zones, and you get to do all of the different resource allocations, what's going where, what's the weather there, what's the weather where it's starting. So definitely needing that baseline of knowledge, the physics, the why do you need this information, and then being able to look at critical infrastructure as a whole other wheelhouse. It's not just a forecast, it's knowing the break points for the cement, for the steel, for the people, the plants, the wildlife, and then being able to communicate that risk to the stakeholders and to our op centers.
That's incredible. You mentioned the recent storms, Helene and Milton, and sort of how these impacted the supply chain and disrupted the IV factories or facilities. Tell me about, when those came through, what's the role of CISA and yourself and responding to those storms, for example? What's sort of the steps as you see, the impacts on those communities and as well as the infrastructure in those spaces?
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about model-derived data and making sure that our stakeholders don't favor one model over another, that they don't find fallacy in stovepiping their efforts based off of one item. So what I do is I take all of the different climatological factors, I put them into this wonderful little PDF book I send out to all of my distribution lists, and that's everyone from public and private sector to government to utilities to just general awareness of different emergency operations centers, the police, the fire department, the hospital staff in different regions. And I just showcase to them, here's the major threat, here's all the different things that are contributing that they may not know atmospherically play a heightened role, where we're looking at the greatest damage and why, whether it's from wind, water, tornadoes, and then really just being able to show that on the back end, what's the concern. If you lose power, temperatures 2 days post are going to surge above 90. Anyone without HVAC, major concern, loss of refrigeration, loss of cooling, especially cooling for major facilities, homes, all of those different implications. And then that you're able to communicate additional hazards. Mosquitoes coming into the area, what does it mean if we're seeing increases of things like yellow fever, dengue, malaria? Where are they surging? Where do they go during these hurricane events? There's so much information sharing that's asked for. So my big part as an extreme weather outreach is solely on giving as much data, making sure I'm a part of the calls, making sure I'm answering questions, pointing them in the direction of their local National Weather Service, looking at the National Hurricane Center engagement opportunities as we get closer to landfall. So a lot of pre-warning and then a lot of just offering support. And then our PSAs, which are our protective security advisors, they show up on site with FEMA to talk about where our critical infrastructure is while FEMA moves resources, that we're able to isolate which areas need to be addressed immediately, which areas might run out of fuel for generators, which ones might need water supplies, cooling supplies, and that we're able to do the most as efficiently and effectively as possible. So it's a definite mass joint effort. Being a part of it at this stage is fantastic because I've been, touting a lot of this data over the last couple of years, amplification concerns, threats across the board, and then being able to now say, we already had 4 of these storms reach an intensity that was record-breaking. What does this mean for next year? So while we're still finishing out this year, we are already starting to look forward into how do we, if it did get destroyed, how do we build a better facility to withstand worsening events in the future?
Tell me more. So, it appears to me that so much of your job is that data, whether it's curating, sharing, disseminating, etc. Tell me more about the services and sort of the resources that you provide in line with that data and how you get that information out, because that seems like the critical, at least a critical function of what you do.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to immediate offerings of engagement. So somebody reaches out, they're like, hey, Sunny's done a fantastic job on previous calls. I'd like to have her on this call. I'll ask if I'm going to have a speaking role, do you want slides? You can make these slides distributable, and then I'll send them out even further. And then from there, they actually go on to additional distribution lists, and then that can go even further depending on how they want to scale and scope all of that data. What we do on my side on the sharing of information and the collecting of information, while there's the initial open source data scraping, then there's my meteorological expertise that comes in. There's also all the different distros that I'm a part of within other parts of the communities on the scientific side. So whether it's some of the healthcare information that's getting passed to me where they're saying, please pass this along further, whether it's FEMA's resource allocation pages or the 101 pages, making sure that I'm rolling up as much as can be beneficial without being overwhelming into a lot of these kind of info-centric emails so that they're able to pass them as applicable. They can cannibalize it. I cannibalize a lot of things to make it make the most sense in the fastest time possible. So a lot of the data scraping is just me solely like going through and actually reading, reviewing, polling, statistics, historical implications, building breakpoints, and then communicating that out in that concise with citations going back to the resource. They're able to pull more, but it is very data heavy, and it's not frequent emails. I do one a day per major event, and then I do weeklies. And those weeklies are massive repositories of new studies, statistics, dashboards, products, and then CISA's got a extreme weather website, and on that website we link to a bunch of our interagency federal partners. We have fact sheets on like the Resilient Power Best Practices Guide for critical infrastructure. We have extreme weather and emergency telecommunications as a fact sheet, so you can talk to your stakeholders, make sure they're considering these things, taking action where applicable, and that they're able to get like certificates on training when they get new staff, that they're able to really find their way to take that first step forward and getting the knowledge base to ask the right questions ahead of the disaster.
How does like the advent, or not the, I mean, it's not new, but AI is, bigger than ever. Generative AI has really exploded onto the scene. How does that impact your job? Because there is so much data and there is so much analysis that goes into what you're doing.
There's definitely a twofold. There's the beneficial side and the hindrance side, right? Like we may have seen it on the back end of Milton, social media, some of the different meteorologist communities of interest. So some of the people who may not have a degree in it, but might be just a person who's really studied it on their own time, utilizing some of the model derivative data, utilizing some AI imaging even to tout a incoming storm, what was going to be this mass devastating event that was going to follow Milton and take out the rest of Florida. And that misinformation battle where because they propagate an image, everyone else then copy pastes it, and then it makes it too far forward, and the rest of the scientific community has to spend our extra time chasing that down, nipping it in the bud before it gets too far ahead of us, so that we're not over allocating resources, private sector's not spinning up in a poor way. And then we look at the other side of AI use, which is an amplification of the workforce, right? So I'm the only meteorologist doing weather support in CISA. So that's a lot of work for just one human being. So when we're looking at AI, we're looking at it as utilizing comprehensive of historic data, so making sure that it's ingesting the correct information, valid information, so that we can reduce the hallucination threat on the lead side, that we're not asking it questions that we know it can't answer because we're not scoping the question right. So when we're engaging with AI, whether it's somebody in their downtime within the agency who then comes to the table with a question, or, hey, Sunny, we used AI to do a summary of what we expect for hurricane season. Can you cross-validate it? That's adding to my plate. And when I look at it and I'm like, this makes no sense, what did you even ask it? And they're like, tell me about hurricanes. And you're like, that's not the question that you really want, though. You want to know specifically about the Atlantic basin. You need to specify, because hurricanes take a different name in every basin. They're all tropical cyclones. So maybe we need to start looking at asking those questions, answering the asks in a way that makes sense by talking to experts as opposed to just jumping in with it. I love the concept of utilizing AI for some of our historic implications. So one of the project sets that I'm working on is the concept of AI doing review over the past, let's say 10, 15 years to start with, on low pressure centers, which are major triggering weather events, right? They're responsible for everything that's precipitation oriented. So tropical cyclones are lows, continental systems are lows. And what ends up happening is over time with a warming atmosphere, we could see that there is an actual tie-in that low pressures are getting deeper and slower moving. If that's the case, it would explain why high pressures are dominating so much more, which is the drying and that direct solar radiation and the wildfire concern. And then the area between the two would see stronger, more persisting winds, which dries out vegetation, fuels fires, so many more additional problem sets. So if the case is lows are slowing down by, let's say, 2%, deepening by 3% over a 15-year average, and every 15 years we've seen an increase by X, that you would be able to feed that into forecasts going forward instead of just training it off of surface symptoms, that you're able to identify the true root cause and make it make sense to the models so that your models now handle forecasts way further out. You can see upper atmospheric low pressures about a month and a week in advance before they make their way into the US. Training models on that concept versus surface implications prevents this issue where the model doesn't understand hurricanes coming up to the US getting pushed away from the US because of frontal boundaries there. Not all models understand continental systems and don't know that there's a frontal boundary. So that boomerang you see away from the US that storms do, it's because a front's there. But if you don't train it to recognize the front, it's going to say, oh, this is going to make landfall and destroy this entire region. But scientifically, that's not possible. So when people come back and they say, well, what if the models are wrong and it goes that way? You have to explain physics to them. And AI can really kind of help curb my load when it comes to so many of these different data set needs, use cases, advocations, and narrative summaries, which is a lot of work, again, of one person during all the other work.
I'm sure. It's fascinating. I'm sure this is a very simplistic way, and this is not exactly what's going to happen, but you would imagine with that ability to churn bigger data sets with AI that prediction could get better and that you will potentially get to a place where we're better at predicting extreme weather and things like that. Is that too simplistic to say, or in so many words, are we moving in a direction that things could get more accurate, or like you said, there's a longer tail where we can see things further in advance?
We'll definitely be able to see things coming. We'll be able to annotate regions are of concern for this week and really pivot focus, which will allow us to reduce focus in other areas. That's a big part of reducing burnout. So I'm a big fan of anything that helps with that. Helping to prevent people from just looking over their shoulder constantly in a paranoid fear that a weather event's going to sneak up on them after this one that they're recovering from. When we're looking at AI in future forecasting, a lot of people, every year I hear this from a different technology that emerges within the weather field. We did this when we found our first models and we were using Excel to do the visuals of the moisture field, which were spot specific, right? Very data heavy. Excel was not something widely understood at the time. So when it was adopted, we had a handful of experts. It's going to be really moist during these periods, there and by the forecast should be rain. And then we modified that. So if you look back over the last 100 years of forecasting, right, and you look at what did we do, when did we do it? When satellites came about, trying to use that for forecasting, hard. There's a lot of local surface features. You can't see the low clouds. You can't see a whole lot once the storm develops. You can see the storm, but that's pretty much the extent of it. You can see the turning in the winds, in the rain by the cloud bands. And then what you're able to see now is you have radar. When radar got adopted, everyone was like, oh, this is going to remove our need for forecasters. Well, that didn't happen. And then we got into model data, and then models were going to reduce the need for forecasters. But now if you rely on models too much, that's a major fallacy of doing forecasting. You become what's referred to as a model baby. When you're looking at some of the different emerging technologies and applying them to the weather field, it is such an intensive science. There's so many overlapping, interlinking things that we don't know. And if we don't know, we can't train the AI model on it. We still have a long way to go integrating AI into forecasting because it does need to be scoped and shaped and reviewed and cross-validated. It needs to understand topography, geology, ecology, all of these different scientific fields. It needs to understand the magnetosphere, the ionosphere. When a major solar event comes in, it can have implications down at the surface. There are all these additional things we're still finding out about. The amplification of heat, increasing hail size, increasing lightning strike frequency, that's not in our model data, but it will be going forward because the studies just now came out about that. It's such an intensive process that I believe AI holds a key to understanding a lot more and to refining those forecasts on the threat side. Will it completely remove forecasters' capabilities in the future of being a part of that engagement? Absolutely not. There will always be a role for like the human review of the data, the human review of topography, the application of the knowledge base. Where we've built up infrastructure, our models don't know that. They don't know that you paved over that entire region and that water won't be absorbed and then flood out the community downstream. It can only warn you about the weather event. We still need, if anything, we need our meteorologists to grow and take on more emergency management capabilities so that they can understand why their forecast matters. What numbers really disrupt a community, disrupt operations or flow of supplies?
Yeah, no, you make a really compelling case. That's very interesting. We were talking a little bit before, we jumped on the actual mics recording. But there's, I think about it in the way we've been describing it and sort of how data and technology can be used to sort of do the prediction, the forecasting, and sort of use that to enhance, increase sustainability and work on, being better with the climate and resilience. But there's also the opposite that we discussed in that, that technology also has a major toll on the climate, and that's something that's been a major topic of discussion, especially as AI and the data centers connected to it are really being tapped for more and more compute power. So tell me about, if at all, how you're thinking about that within your role at CISA, given the sort of nexus of weather and critical infrastructure and cybersecurity and all of those combined.
There is so much good overlap that happens when we're talking about the IT side of the house and weather. IT needing the energy being at risk from the weather events. If energy goes down and the data center goes dark, what happens? Andy Bachman from the National Labs has a fantastic piece on extreme heat and drought implications on data center operations. We also at CISA did an extreme heat and drought implications to data center as a tool and as a major case so that the data centers are able to consider what does it mean to need water for cooling but to not have that water made available to them based off of restrictions of flow, actual loss of water at the surface, or just where they're choosing to build in the future. Are they in an area that's more susceptible to drought or flood or both? The energy pull and the water pull from these new AI centers, Des Moines, Iowa had a great study that came out that when they were test bedding open AI, the site that was running used 6% of the city's water during the time of the initial test bed period. So that's one building running one mission set that's not even open to the full general public. This was back in 2022. Major concerns for what does it look like if multiple buildings start trying to do that? Where are all these AI jobs going? Where are they really starting to spin up at? Are they aware of the cooling implications for the data centers? Wyoming, California, looking at over in Virginia, Data Center Alley, those areas are starting to experience these crippling heat waves, longer and longer periods where that's really going to stress our grid. And we're talking very heavily across the federal government. What does it look like to see rolling blackouts lasting longer because the heat's just too high for them to be able to operate it at? When we're looking at things like cryptocurrency too, those are usually buddied up along some of our major reservoir systems and river systems. Pulling out water during a period of extreme heat, taking water, running it through your equipment to cool it down, and then putting out hotter water back into that water source increases evaporation rates and over time drains your own reservoir of resource. And so what does it look like to be able to operate crypto, to be able to operate with the hash rates at where they're at, even right now, without them even growing? Looking at data centers, looking at the new AI facilities, where they're being built, the supply chain, where are those chip processing plants going to be put at now going forward? Some of them trying to develop in drought-stricken regions even now. Looking at our mineral and metal hubs, and the major implications of a flood or a fire or the loss of water. You can't do mining without water. So when we're looking at this across the board when it comes to the IT sector side of the house, there's so much need to use what we have for climate data now, where to build smart, how to build smart, using water recycling. And we get all this pushback from private sector and the general public who say water recycling is gross. And I always get to advocate, there's only so much water on the planet as there ever has been, as there ever will be. It's the same water that we started with. There and by, it's all recycled water. So having a purification system on site just is a smart idea to do in the first place. The less you need from the city, the more benefit we can advocate that you're doing. Because you're building a new site, you're using concrete cement, that's an immediate negative. You're utilizing resources, you need to put in pipes, that's a negative. You're adding to the supply chain burden, you're pulling off the energy sector. If you look at the actual startup of one of these sites. There's a lot of negatives, and then they say, oh, and then every year we're going to pull more energy, more water from your community. You have to be able to say, well, besides on, the workforce side of the house, we're going to benefit you, or on creativity, on all these other fronts that aren't tangible right now, but we promise it'll be worth it. I would say it'd be better to come to the table and say, we've looked at the implications of weather events. We're going to build a building that winds aren't going to destroy right off the bat, that a hailstorm won't cripple, and we're going to give back to the community. We're going to produce a surplus of energy, perhaps. That would be an ideal. Looking at the Salesforce Tower in California is a really good example of climate resilient structures. They have black water recycling and they have renewables on site to the point where they're able to export to the city during good periods of time. That's a major touting win for a tower that large. I'd like to see more facilities like that when they come in to build, that they're looking at benefiting the community with the actual physical structure.
And from a CISA and DHS perspective on that topic, is your role just to provide that awareness, to kind of be a part of that conversation? Where do you kind of fit into, because obviously there's the private sector implications, and that's revenue, that's profit. They're going to be pushing towards maybe things that aren't in the best interests of the nation or those communities. Where does CISA and DHS kind of fit into the conversation there?
So CISA is a major purveyor of information, and that's the big phrase I always like to use is I'm here to share as much as possible to make sure that everyone's tracking the threat, that they're tracking implication, they're tracking backups, right? So if you put all your eggs in one basket, are you doomed for failure? And across, the entirety of CISA's workforce advocating for the security of not only the cyber side, but the critical infrastructure side. The last thing that Homeland Security wants is to build something critical to the nation's operations and then have it fail during the first major event, weather-wise or otherwise. So a big part of it is bringing the sectors to the table, bringing these building operators, owners to the table and saying, are we using the same resources? Our dam sector is incredibly engaging. Our energy sector, our ISACs that we work very closely with, we love the sharing of information back and forth. So if I see a threat, I will make sure that they're aware that I'm tracking it. If I see a resource drain, that I'm asking, are they taking that into consideration so that I can say that they're doing something about it? So I will make sure to flag new studies that have come out, say, hey, I saw this. It states that the technology you're using might be more of a burden than a benefit. Can you walk me through some of the ways that, this might be a bigger benefit than a drain, so that we can kind of help work with them on some of those resiliency plans? Not everything is national. Some of our best practices come from international owners and operators and some of the studies that come out abroad. So you're able to bring those to the table when you have these talks and say, have you considered this other technology? Have you considered painting your roof white for cooling? Have you considered shading, utilizing the trees that your local city planner is advocating? Have you even touched base with the local city planner next door as opposed to just the one you needed permission from? So there's a lot of cross-sector engagement. We host a ton of working groups where people can come in, ask questions, and it really helps to break down those barriers and the silos of data. I know everyone's got, their own mission set. They've got their own profit margins to be aware of. As a federal resource, I'm free, which makes it way easier for me to be able to just reach out and say, I have a bunch of stuff for you so that you're able to build the best building that you can and that you're able to serve the community in a way that makes sense for everybody.
That's great. So as a final kind of closing question, what should we look forward to? We talked about AI is here, it's bigger than ever. We've talked about extreme weather getting more intense and more frequent. With those sorts of things and those sorts of trends in mind, whether it's at the intersection or independent in their own ways, what should people think about when it comes to weather, extreme weather, and what you guys do at CISA?
Yeah, DHS has this fantastic saying that all emergencies start local. They also end local. So really bringing everything back down to that local level is a big part of the concepts going forward when we're talking about extreme weather damages, when we're talking about the overall climatological shifts that are occurring. These are really big storms. These are really big problem sets. And they're a huge burden on communities. Making sure that communities feel empowered at that most local level is a big part of it. So if it's engaging with the sectors who are coming into the region and developing it, that's, absolutely love to see that kind of sharing. And when we're talking about all the different ways that we can use innovation going forward to find new building materials, new building shapes, that you're able to start using all these emerging technologies, especially AI's creativity side of the house, to help you think outside the box and bring your stakeholders outside the box as well. So when we're talking about major disasters, this was a fun one that I think was a best case that came forward from the COP27, I believe, where Metaverse actually had a virtual reality version of it for everyone who couldn't attend in person, that you could throw on a VR headset or you could log in on your phone and you could have your little avatar walk around and engage with people in a giant forum from your home. And they talked there about starting up VR op centers that you would be able to, within your community of interest, have your own little op center and everyone could log in remotely. So in a disaster where some of your staff's displaced, that you don't have to worry about, their lapse in work if they've just gone and they've taken an emergency shelter 2 states over and they have to be there for a week. What does that look like for the continuity of business? Because that's a big deal. So there's definitely a lot to be said about the innovative future, what's going to be brought to the table, how it's going to be brought to the table. I'm a big fan of disaster drives innovation. Unfortunately, usually we don't fund innovation until a disaster kicks off, but now that we have all these disasters, we have a ton of innovation going on. Better use cases, there's definitely going to be a rapid expansion in the knowledge of the climate, which is great. We are learning so much. When you think back 100 years, right? 100 years ago is a very different time period across this country. And you look at what was built, most of these metro systems were built in the 60s. These buildings, my home was built in the 70s. It wasn't even around 100 years ago. So the fact that we're learning at the rate at which we are now with the supercomputers even, right? And those are cumbersome and you have to wait your turn. AI really puts the power in your hands to be able to run some sort of inquisitive push where it does a lot of data scraping, whether or not it's accurate, just off the get-go, it can trigger some creative rabbit holes of research, and those will still be beneficial. So yes, cross-validating is going to be a cumbersome part of the process, but it'll bring that innovative part that we frequently lapse on because we get so stuck in this is how we've always done things, or this is my understanding of the environment, this is my understanding of the built environment. AI brings that as a challenge because it'll show you pictures that are obscenely impossible and you have to be like, well, no, but actually you could. And those kinds of nuggets I think are critical to moving forward.
You're an absolute wealth of insight. I feel like I've learned so much from you, and a lot of it probably flew over my head just given my lack of climate, weather, meteorological understanding, but it's been fantastic catching up with you. I really appreciate the time, and I think this is going to be something that, as you mentioned already, is going to become even more critical as we move on. So I definitely think the listeners are going to get a lot out of this, and hopefully we'll see more innovation and advancement in this space to go forward.
Yeah, I definitely want to encourage that. If anybody's got any fun new nuggets that they've seen floating around, new products, new dashboards, tools, I always like getting to test bed new things just to see what they look like. There's a lot of learning curve that has to be adopted even at my age. So there's definitely a lot of use cases, and I'm excited to engage with whoever at this point. So definitely excited for the future.
Well, Sunny, thank you so much.
For more on AI and the environment, make sure to visit fedscoop.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Daily Scoop podcast, available on all podcast platforms. If you've already rated the podcast on your platform of choice, thanks so much. High ratings and good reviews of the show help more people to find it. The Daily Scoop podcast is a production of the Scoop News Group in Washington, D.C. Adam Butler and Carlin Fisher help put the show together, and the entire Scoop News Group team contributes. We'll be back tomorrow with more top headlines. Until then, I'm your host, Billy Mitchell. Thanks so much for listening.